American courts used to acknowledge this until about 1919. Step 4. Where compensation is in cash, a direct purchase is often considered as preferable to compulsory acquisition. In Vietnam, local authorities often sell land at competitive land auctions to determine the market price. Compulsory acquisition is a last resort where the owner refuses to sell. But for the word compensation to be meaningful, it has to compensate. Step 5. To acknowledge the fact of disagreement, one may need to go a step beyond the proposal in the minister's statement on the proposed constitutional amendment with regard to Article 26 of the 1995 Constitution. This would mean to deposit with the courts not just the amount offered by government, but an additional amount, keeping in mind the compensation demanded by the owner. In addition, it may be necessary to rationalize the appeal process so it does not consume undue time. In Kenya, for example, appeals used to go to the High Court till 1990. After that, the law created specialized compensation tribunals. Step 6. Should compensation be the same for all? And this is a critical question. Political philosophers talk of two types of compensation: individual and social. And let me explain the difference between the two. Utilitarian thinkers have called for individual compensation. In other words, equal justice for each individual. This disregards the difference between categories of individuals. The key opponent to this view has been the American philosopher John Rawls. Rawls, at Harvard, his last position, calls for justice as fairness, not as individual justice, but as social justice. Rawls calls for an emphasis on public good. Lay juries in the US before 1919 used to select a measure of fairness which would ensure that the worst affected group would end up marginally better off. So the idea was not that everybody would be treated equally, but the worst off would be treated better than the wealthiest. And this compensation should thus involve an element of social redistribution, and this is justified as a consideration of the public good. Now let me come to Uganda and place this question in a historical and contemporary context. We all know that one size does not fit all. Questions may be universal, but answers are not. As we now know, no one answer is true for all times and places. All answers are historical and contextual. It is true that we can learn something from the study of other times and places, but that cannot be a substitute for a study of this time and this place. So let us focus on Uganda. I will begin with the history of compulsory land acquisition. That history begins with the 1900 agreement and the expropriation of 8,000 square miles of land in which all customary rights of Vibanja owners were abrogated. These rights were transferred to roughly 1,000 recipients of Milo land, owners of Taka. Rather than an exercise in the right of public domain in the public interest, this needs to be understood as an exercise in the right of conquest. The conquering state turned the right of eminent domain into an exercise in expropriation of land rights of the vast majority. It was an expropriation without compensation. The expropriation of property was part of a larger injustice, ethnic cleansing. The most notorious act of ethnic cleansing was the forced removal of Catholics from Mengo and its surroundings to Masaka. The next major exercise in the right of public domain was the 1928 Busuru and Ngujo law. With its passage, the state put a statutory limit on the ground rent, obusuru, and the rent on cash crops, enbujo, that the taka holder could demand from the bibanja owner. The result was to qualify the right of private property. It can be understood as partial restitution for the previously expropriated majority, expropriated without any compensation. The justification was historical, partially correcting an injustice whereby Milo landowners had been beneficiaries of large-scale property through state-initiated political lodges, rather than any market-based transaction. The third notable exercise in public domain was the 1995 Land Act under Idi Amin. It declared all land estate land and all landowners and users as lessees and sublessees of the state. The final act in this historical chain was the 1995 Constitution, which restored the rights of landowners at the expense of Kibanja dwellers. If we pass judgment on these developments, or let me say, I would like to pass some judgment on these developments and draw a few lessons from history. 1. 1900 was unjustified. The colonial state turned the right of eminent domain into an exercise in expropriation of small peasants without any compensation. Number 2, in contrast, 1928 was justified. The colonial state used the sovereign right to make law to provide some restitution, justice, for those who had tilled the land. Number 3, 1995, the Amin decree was justified, broadly speaking, since it built on 1928 and abrogated the remaining rights, some of the remaining rights of taka owners. Finally, 1995 was a return to the 1900 agreement in the interest of owners of big landed property. 1995 should be understood as a counter-revolution, and we should ask ourselves, why was it possible? There is also a history of expropriation outside Uganda, especially in the north and east of the country. In all these cases, whether in the colonial period or after, as during the counterinsurgency in Karamoja, Acholi, and Teso, expropriation was without compensation. These cases of historical injustice have been documented by students at Makerere Institute of Social Research in numerous research studies. Questions of historical injustice need to be dealt with separately at a time when the political climate is right. I would like to return to the question I posed earlier, whether all landowners should be treated the same. For a start, landowners are not all the same. There are three kinds of landowners. There is the speculator, there is the owner of small property, and there is the big property owner, who I would like to distinguish from the speculator. The speculator is one who has bought the land with the foreknowledge that compulsory acquisition will soon be on the agenda and the expectation of making a handsome profit. My suggestion is that speculators need to be penalized rather than rewarded. Should I conclude the rest are speculators? Is this audience loaded? If so, I look to the audience outside. All land bought in anticipation of the announcement of a project by those in a position to access such information, or bought after the announcement of the project, also with the expectation of making a speculative gain, I suggest that all those who bought the land during a year or so before the project was announced be paid the sum at which they bought the land as just compensation. not a shilling more. They should get what they pay. I'll come to the question of that it'll be tough. Indeed, it'll be tough. This leaves with two groups with a rightful claim for fair compensation. The first is the kibanja owner, one for whom the property is the principal source of livelihood. Property for the kibanja owner is not only an economic asset, it also has emotional and sentimental value because it would mean a loss of ties to an area and a loss of friendship and kinship ties. In my view, this is the group with the most legitimate claim on compensation, one that goes beyond the market value of the land to include financial compensation for non-monetary injuries, loss of ancestral land, disruption of kinship relations, etc. Finally, there is the large-scale property owner, for whom the land does not constitute the main source of income or livelihood. This is the owner who both has a claim to fair compensation and the resources to clear procedural hurdles. The real challenge is how to handle this group. In my view, this is a political challenge. To understand its nature, we need to return to the two cases where the state was able to use eminent domain to qualify the rights of owners of Taka in the interest of kibanja owners and in the larger interest of development. Let's begin with the first case, is the 1928 Busulu and Vuju law.